Have you ever heard terms like ESG, net zero, or scope 3 and just felt lost? Like you're trying to decode a secret language? Well, you are not alone. Today, we are cracking that code. We are going to decode the entire alphabet soup of sustainability and create a clear, simple guide to the language of climate action. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what's being said, what's being promised, and what's actually being measured in this global effort.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We've structured this whole thing like a funnel. We're going to start with the one big idea that kicked this all off. Then we'll zoom out to the global pacts it inspired. From there, we'll see how the business world got involved, learn the exact way they count their environmental impact, and finally, we'll define the finish line that everyone's racing toward. Sound good? Let's dive in.
All right, first things first. Before we get into all the targets and treaties and acronyms, we need to get grounded in the one single idea that holds this entire conversation together: sustainability. What does that word actually mean? This right here, this is our starting point. It comes from a huge UN report way back in 1987. And it's so powerful because it's not just about, recycling or planting trees. It's about fairness between generations. The whole challenge is balancing three things: a healthy environment, a strong economy, and social well-being. True sustainability means you can't sacrifice one for the others. It basically frames everything we do today as a loan from our kids and grandkids.
So, to get sustainability right, we have to manage one central problem: greenhouse gases, or GHGs. Think of them like a blanket around the Earth. They let sunlight in, but they trap heat and stop it from escaping. Now, CO₂ from burning fossil fuels is the most famous one, of course, but this group also includes way more potent stuff like methane from agriculture or refrigerants from our air conditioners. Managing this whole basket of gases is the technical challenge at the heart of climate action.
Okay, so we have the science. Let's move to the global stage and see how that scientific understanding turned into a worldwide political movement, one that led to some of the most important international agreements in modern history. This timeline really shows you that this wasn't an overnight thing. It started with a foundational treaty back in 1992, but honestly, for decades, progress was really slow and difficult. The real breakthrough, the moment everything changed, was 2015. That was a landmark year where all these years of diplomacy finally came together in two massive agreements: the Paris Agreement, which set a hard target for temperature rise, and the SDGs, which gave us a much broader vision for a sustainable world. This was the moment the world finally had a shared playbook. The best way to think about these three is like a pyramid of action. At the base, you have the UNFCCC. That's like the constitution that gets every country in the room. Then you've got the Paris Agreement, which is the specific law with that legally binding target to limit warming. And at the top, you have the SDGs. They're the societal blueprint, reminding us that you can't fix the climate without also fighting poverty and inequality. Together, they form a pretty comprehensive plan. So, we've got these huge global goals. But, governments can't do it all by themselves. So the next logical question was, how do you get the engine of the entire global economy, the business world, pulling in the exact same direction? Well, that meant a whole new language, and a new mindset had to be created. This slide shows a really fundamental shift in thinking. For decades, companies talked about CSR, corporate social responsibility. That was usually about charity, philanthropy, an ethical choice to do good. ESG completely reframed the conversation. It's not about charity, it's about risk, and it's about value. The big idea with ESG is that things like carbon emissions, labor conditions, and board oversight, these aren't just ethical nice-to-haves anymore. They are material, financial factors that can directly help or hurt a company's bottom line. And here's how ESG went from just a concept to a massive market force. Organizations like the UNPRI got the world's biggest investors to sign on. And we're talking about more than 2,700 institutions that control over $100 trillion in assets. So when that much money starts asking for data on your carbon footprint, you don't really have a choice. You have to measure it, and you have to manage it. Money talks, and it started demanding ESG data. Okay, so businesses are now on board, and investors are asking all these tough questions. But to manage something like your carbon footprint, you first have to be able to measure it accurately. This led to a standardized accounting system for greenhouse gases, which we know as the scopes. Let's start with Scope 1. Think of this as the smoke from your own fire. It's your direct emissions. So imagine a clothing company. Their Scope 1 emissions would be the gas they burn in their factory boilers, or the fuel in the delivery trucks they own. It's anything they burn themselves, right there. It's the most direct piece of the puzzle and, frankly, the easiest part to measure. Next up is Scope 2. This covers the emissions from the energy you buy. So for our clothing company, this is the carbon footprint of the electricity they purchase from the utility to power their sewing machines and keep the lights on. The emissions don't happen at their factory, they happen at the power plant down the road. But because the company chooses to use that power, they are responsible for the emissions that come with it. And finally, we get to Scope 3. And folks, this is the big one. This is basically everything else. It covers a company's entire value chain. So for our clothing company, that's emissions from growing the cotton, shipping it to the factory, business travel, and even the energy customers use to wash and dry the clothes at home. For most companies, Scope 3 is over 75% of their total emissions. It is the hardest to measure, by far, but it's where the biggest impact is. It's absolutely critical for real accountability. So, with a standard way to count emissions across all three scopes, companies can finally set some meaningful goals. But what's the ultimate finish line? What are we all aiming for? This last section is all about defining that target everyone is racing towards. This is the gold standard, net zero. And the key principle here is reduction first. A real net zero plan means a company has to cut its emissions from all three scopes by 90% or more. It's about fundamentally changing how you do business, not just paying someone else to balance your pollution. Only those last few, truly unavoidable emissions can then be neutralized by pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. The priority is to stop polluting in the first place. Now, these two terms get confused all the time, but the difference is huge. Think of your emissions like a leaky bucket. Being carbon neutral is often like just pouring more water into the bucket to match what's leaking out. You're balancing the system, often by buying offsets. Net zero, on the other hand, is about fixing the leak itself. It demands deep, deep cuts across all greenhouse gases, so there's barely anything leaking out at all. Offsets are only for the last few drips you absolutely can't stop. So what are these offsets we keep talking about? Well, basically, they're payments for projects that reduce or remove greenhouse gases from the air. Think planting a forest or capturing methane from a landfill. But, and this is a big but, they can be pretty controversial. It can be really hard to prove that the carbon reduction wouldn't have just happened anyway, or that those trees you planted will actually survive for 100 years. That's why credible net zero plans say you should only use them as a total last resort. And all of this brings us to the most important issue, accountability. With so many companies making big promises, how do we separate real commitment from just, slick marketing? That's where the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTi, comes in. Think of them as the independent referee. Companies submit their reduction plans, and the SBTi scientists validate whether their targets are actually ambitious enough to line up with the Paris Agreement's goals. It's like a stamp of scientific approval. So there you have it. We've gone from a big 35-year-old ethical idea all the way down to a technical system for checking corporate climate goals. We started with the why, sustainability. We saw the global what, the Paris Agreement. We understood how business got involved with ESG and the scopes. And we defined the finish line as net zero, all checked and verified by the SBTi. Each piece builds logically right on top of the last. And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Understanding this language is the first essential step. It gives you the power to read a company's report or listen to a politician's speech and know what they're truly promising. But the knowledge is just the tool. The next and most important step is using that tool to ask the right questions and to hold these organizations accountable for turning all these words and promises into real, measurable change. Thanks for joining this explainer.